Our third tactic today is called electioneering. This is going to be when interest groups are trying to influence the outcome of elections. And here we see a great example of that. We see President Trump giving a speech at the NRA, but what's more important is the message down at the bottom. This is the NRA, an interest group that we know very well. They have endorsed Donald Trump. That means they are encouraging their members to vote for Donald Trump, which is a form of trying to influence the outcome of elections. Electioneering is when interest groups try to influence what happens in an election. This is where groups end up having a preference in who runs the government. But this is not because they're loyal to Democrat or Republicans. This is because they think that they know what one of these candidates would do. So they would intervene and try to influence the outcome of an election if one of the two candidates seems more likely to pass the policies that the interest group wants. So the interest group wants to help the candidates that are going to share the interest group's policy goals. Some of the ways electioneering happens, the obvious way is when an interest group endorses a candidate. So interest groups, some of them will come out and say, vote for this person. Like we just saw, the NRA says, vote for Donald Trump. You might see an environmental interest group endorse a particular candidate because they have a good policy plan. You might have labor unions endorse a particular candidate and try to encourage workers to vote for them. But endorsements are like a normal way that electioneering occurs. Also, interest groups are likely to donate to a candidate's campaign. We know this has to take place through a political action committee, but most interest groups have political action committees so that they can donate to candidates' campaigns. This often goes hand in hand with lobbying, what we were just talking about. So the lobbying will occur and the meeting will be taking place and the lobbyists will be talking about here's how you should pass the policies and all this kind of stuff. And also here's donations we'll make to your campaign if you try to pass this law. Donating money to a campaign is one of the main ways electioneering takes place. They can encourage people to vote. They can mobilize their members to try to go vote for candidates that support their policies. This is a little more vague than a specific endorsement. And then another thing several interest groups do is they put out report cards. They put out report cards on all the different members of Congress or lawmakers in an area to let the group members know how the candidates have acted in the past. Does it line up with the wishes of the group? Very famously, the NRA issues report cards, and they give A's to members of Congress that protect gun rights, and they get F's to members of Congress that try to restrict gun rights. A lot of members of Congress are somewhere in between. They get B's or C's from the NRA, and this is a signal to their voters to their members of their group for how they should be voting. Those donations to campaigns are very important. Interest groups donate money to candidates. They think that the candidates have a chance of winning, and they think that the candidates will pass their policies if they get in office. So the interest groups donate money to those candidates, and they expect to get access to those candidates if that person wins. What we'll find out is that interest groups will donate money, and the candidate who gets money from that interest group is going to be obligated to meet with that interest group when they're in office. So this is a way where like a donation basically opens the door to get you a meeting with that candidate later. We'll see a lot of interest groups. In fact, if we look them up, we'll see a lot of interest groups who donate to both candidates in a race. This is almost always true in presidential races. Big interest groups will donate to the Democrat and the Republican in the maximum amount. Even in small state races, interest groups will donate to the Republican and the Democrat. Like we said, they don't care who wins. They just want to make sure that whoever does win is open to meeting with the interest group later. Groups expect that the candidate, once they get in office, that candidate will support the policy stance of the interest group. While we don't call this bribery, this is where interest groups give money to political officials and they expect support for their policies in return. Our final tactic today is going to be called litigation, and I really hope you guys recognize that building in the background there. Here we have representatives from the NAACP. They are standing in front of the Supreme Court. So we know that they are using the courts to try to influence policy here, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about litigation. Litigation means that interest groups are trying to use the court system to get policies changed. This means that they're suing, right? They are suing the government about a particular policy, maybe suing a business or something like that, but they're suing to try to get policies changed by the judges. In a lot of cases, this is the last resort for a interest group that's like unable to sway public opinion. This is the group may be like using the courts because they see a law as unconstitutional or discriminatory or something like that. If they're unable to sway public opinion, it's often more successful to try to sway a judge. Our most famous example of interest group litigation is Brown versus the Board of Education. In this case, the NAACP, an interest group we know very well, they provided the lawyers in this case. So they found a plaintiff that they could use as a good plaintiff to try to challenge the segregated schools. So the NAACP wanted to challenge segregation in court. They weren't successful at winning over the public because at the time, like, there's voter discrimination so rampant that black voters were unable to vote in southern states. So they weren't able to sway over the like racist voters of the 1950s. They wouldn't be able to get segregation changed through lobbying because those decision makers were worried about the voters. And they didn't really have the money, or the money would not have been persuasive enough to try to endorse candidates in electioneering. They would, if they endorsed candidates, it wouldn't have helped the candidates at the time in the 1950s. So they resorted to the courts. And here they found a plaintiff in Linda Brown that they could use to represent the issue and to make oral arguments about before the federal courts. And the federal courts, of course, sided with Brown versus Board, which means this was a litigation victory for the NAACP. They were able to change the policy through the courts when the other tactics weren't successful. Another thing interest groups will do often at court is use an amicus curiae brief. We've talked about these before. Amicus curiae briefs mean they're briefs from a friend of the court. This brief is supposed to include like expert information. This is extra stuff that the court can consider when they're listening to a case. Amicus briefs happen when the interest group is not one of the litigants in a case. So they're not directly involved in the case, but they still care how the case gets decided, and they want to try to sway the opinion of the judge or the jury. The ultimate goal of an amicus curiae brief is to try to change the outcome of the decision. So they want to influence the outcome of the case here. The decision might be made by a judge or might be made by the jury, but they're going to get access to the information that's in the amicus brief. And then if the group is successful, this is another form of influencing the policy. Another major form of litigation is what we call class action lawsuits. Interest groups are often behind class action lawsuits, and what these do is they allow a small group of people to sue, usually like sue a company or something like this, but a small group of people is suing, and they're representing all people who have been impacted in the same way. So everybody doesn't have to file their own lawsuit here, but a class action lawsuit gets a few people actually suing, and they represent a class of all people harmed. The interest group is going to reach out to the public, and they're going to try to find all the people that belong to this class. So, for example, a few years ago, there was a class action lawsuit against Red Bull because Red Bull had made some claims that they were like a very healthy drink or something like that. So like a small group of people was suing them. The interest group that was in charge of their case put out ads all over the place trying to find people who purchased Red Bull in a particular window of time, and those people could join the class. So when the public finds out about the class action lawsuit, they can join the class. They don't have to go to court. Those small group of people is representing all of them. And so if the class action lawsuit wins, then the settlement from the company gets divided up among all of the people who joined the class. So in the example of this Red Bull case, it was the Red Bull had to pay millions and millions of dollars for their like false claims, but that money got divided up between everyone who joined the class, and so everyone who joined the class got a check for like $4. But it was a successful class action lawsuit by an interest group here. They were able to impact policy by using a small group of people to sue. Just a couple other examples of class action lawsuits here. There's a very famous class action lawsuit from smokers against the tobacco industry. The tobacco companies had hidden information about how much disease was caused by smoking cigarettes and things like that. They ended up being sued by a small class, and it represented all smokers across the country. It ended up in over $205 billion in settlements. Those got sent out to the states, and the states had to divide those up among the classes. Blockbuster Video lost a class action lawsuit a long time ago for unfair fees, led to a class action lawsuit for all customers, which was the Blockbuster had to pay so much money that what they had to do is they had to give all of their customers like several free rentals as the settlement. We just talked about the Red Bull case here. There was an AT&T case a couple years ago where people were being charged for texts without their consent. So there was a class action lawsuit, and all that settlement, more than $2 million, got split up among all the customers. So each customer on average received $30. So that's how a class action lawsuit works. A small group of people sues, usually a company. They get some settlement in court, and even though other people that were hurt the same way don't have to be involved in the case, they get a share of the settlement. That's it for our tactics of interest groups today. So it's time to take a look at our bigly ideas. Make sure we remember all the things we need to know about today. Here is our friend President Trump. He is attending a grassroots mobilization event from the March for Life. This is a group that advocates to end abortions in the United States, and President Trump is the first president to ever attend this rally, although they have all been asked to participate. So President Trump is the first president to attend this, and this is an example of grassroots mobilization, because this is a big rally held in Washington, and people see how many people support the group, and that should put pressure on lawmakers to try to find a way to ban abortions. Here's a better picture of President Trump at the same event. He's got his fist up. I guess he's ready to fight somebody. He wants to make sure that we can remember these 4 things today. We need to make sure that we can explain how grassroots mobilization works, and we need to be able to describe examples of groups that might use it. So here we're looking for groups that would have widespread popular support. We want to make sure we can explain how lobbying works, and we need to be able to describe examples of groups that would use it. So what kind of groups would, what we need to think about, what kind of groups could effectively give specialized information to lawmakers in lobbying, right? Like environmental groups, anything like that. Everybody lobbies. Litigation, we need to make sure we can explain how litigation works, as well as describe examples of groups that might use it. So think about the NAACP and Brown versus Board. Think about these consumer protection lawsuits and things like that. Electioneering, we want to make sure we can explain how electioneering works and describe examples of groups that might use it. So here, let's think about groups that don't have widespread appeal but do have widespread money. Something like the American Medical Association, things like that. They have a lot of money, but there's not a huge number of doctors out there. So that's a great example for them. All right, those are the 4 main tactics of interest groups. So now we know all the different kinds of groups there are. We know the different strategies that they would use to influence policy. Now we're going to go to the saddest lesson of the year, not just because it's the last one, but because it shows how corrupt the government can be when interest groups, the bureaucracy, and Congress work together in an iron triangle.